7th meeting of the House Energy, Utilities, and Telecommunications Committee. Welcome everyone here in person and those watching along online. We'll start with bill introductions. Are there any bill introductions from any member of the committee? Seeing none, are there any bill introductions from anyone in the gallery? All right, just a reminder, as you see on the agenda, February 3rd, which unbelievably is next Thursday, is the last day for request of bills to be drafted by the reviser for members of this committee in this room. So we will have 2 more cracks at it if anybody wants to get brave and venture into requesting a bill introduction. So with that, we'll move on. We have a hearing this morning on HCR 5023. I will open the hearing and ask the reviser to give us a brief overview of HCR 5023. Mr. Myers, time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, committee. Again, my name is Nick Myers with the Revisor's Office, and today we are looking at HCR 5023. Committee, what this does is this resolution would state the position that the Kansas Legislature denounces any potential price gouging or market manipulation in the natural gas marketplace that may have occurred during the extreme weather event, February 2021, Winter Storm Uri. So as you all heard previously in this committee, that winter storm caused unprecedented price increases in natural gas and electricity. And the resolution notes that during the 2021 session, the legislature took action to alleviate some of those drastic and the immediate financial impacts of some of those price increases to wholesale natural gas buyers through certain loan programs. And the resolution also recognizes that those immediate relief measures, although very beneficial for certain parties, will continue to impact Kansans over the next decade as those extraordinary prices are continue to be passed down to Kansas ratepayers. In addition to those legislative efforts to protect Kansas utility ratepayer interests, the Kansas Attorney General and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission both possess certain regulatory and investigatory powers that could lead to corrective action if, in fact, profiteering or market manipulation occurred. And both the Attorney General of Kansas and the FERC have announced efforts to investigate those matters. And the resolution supports both of those investigatory efforts. The resolution also notes that should those investigations lead to any corrective action, that the resolution encourages those parties and the entities that regulate utilities in the state to protect the interests of Kansas ratepayers should any financial benefits come from that corrective action. And then if this resolution was passed by both chambers, the copies of the resolution would be sent to the Secretary of State, or the Secretary of State, excuse me, would send copies to the congressional members from Kansas in Congress and the chairperson of the FERC and the Kansas Attorney General. And Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Questions for the reviser? Do you have any questions from online? Any hands raised? No? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Myers. Appreciate the synopsis. First up, we'll take proponent testimony. We have David Nickel from the Citizens Utility Ratepayers Board, or CURB. Mr. Nickel, welcome to the committee.
Thank you. My name is David Nickel. I'm Consumer Counsel for the Citizens Utility Ratepayer Board of Kansas. For those who don't know about CURB, let me take a brief moment to explain what our agency is all about. Our agency was formed in 1989 by the Kansas Legislature and made an independent agency in 1991. It's completely fee-funded. There's no money that comes from state revenue funds to fund our agency. The task of CURB is to protect residential and small commercial ratepayers before the Kansas Corporation Commission and rate cases and other types of dockets that are filed there, and to represent those classes of customers before the Kansas Legislature. As Justin Grady with the KCC noted, the KCC has opened up 7 investigations with regard to electric utilities and natural gas utilities in Kansas as to their response during Winter Storm Uri. CURB has intervened in all of these dockets. I want to point out that first and foremost, our utilities did a great job of keeping us warm during that winter storm, keeping electricity served or continually serviced throughout that period of time. And the utilities have been really great to work with in all of these utility investigations. Stakeholders have been like-minded in these investigations, and through the work of the KCC staff, the stakeholders, and the utilities, we have managed to reduce some of the costs to the ratepayers in millions of dollars in terms of relief. However, to the point of House Concurrent Resolution 5023, the Attorney General's office has also intervened in those dockets, and we welcome the AG's investigation. They've done a great job of discerning the facts that they need to proceed with their investigation without disrupting the conduct of these proceedings. I've met both of the assistant attorney generals that have worked in this. They're very competent lawyers, and I've got every amount of confidence in them. Even though Kansas CURB and the stakeholders have managed to reduce the amount of, have managed to come up with a lot of relief for ratepayers, that relief would be dwarfed by any disgorgement that the Attorney General could, disgorgement of profits that the Attorney Generals could get from suppliers of gas in these proceedings. And so it's very important that the Kansas Legislature express its support for the Kansas Attorney General and to FERC with regard to these investigations. It's important that Kansas speak with one voice on this issue. The Kansas Legislature backing 5023, or the House Concurrent Resolution 5023, goes along those lines, and I stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Nickel. Questions for this conferee? My car warranty's up. So, questions for Mr. Nickel? Any committee member? Anybody online? No. Thank you, sir, for your testimony. Appreciate it. Also, for proponents, we have written-only testimony from Paul Snyder with the Kansas Industrial Consumers Group, Leslie Kaufman with the Kansas Electric Co-ops, and Lynn Rogers, the Kansas State Treasurer. And I note that the Treasurer is here with us. Ms. Treasurer, do you want to say any words to the committee or let your testimony speak for itself? Okay, we will do that. I commend all of those to your reading. Are there any other proponents for House Concurrent Resolution 5023? Okay, seeing none, are there any neutral conferees? Seeing none, are there any opponent conferees on HCR 5023? Seeing none, we will close the public hearing at this time on HCR 5023. Committee, my intention is that we would work this concurrent resolution next Tuesday, probably at the beginning of our time together. If you have proposed amendments, you can talk to the reviser. If there are no amendments, it'll be a fairly quick process for us in working this HCR. So I do ask that you take note of the testimony from Mr. Nickel and the written testimony that's been provided. Some people would say, why are we doing this? Obviously, we don't investigate these things as a legislature, but I think it is important, as Mr. Nickel said, that the legislature speak with one voice on behalf of Kansas ratepayers and say, we believe this is worthy of further investigation. We believe if there is recoupment, that it should go to the benefit of ratepayers across the state, and that these things should not just be forgotten as time goes on, but should continue to be diligently prosecuted until any wrongdoers are found, if any, and that recompense is made for anything that they may have done wrong. So thank you again for all of conferees today on the resolution, and now we'll move into the informational part of our presentation this morning. We have a memorandum for background on collecting revenue from transportation infrastructure from James Fisher in the Kansas Legislative Research Department. As Mr. Fisher comes to the stand to testify, we'll just let you know this is the goal of today's hearings and informational briefings are to talk about electric vehicles, to talk about the rate structures that some states are looking at as electric vehicles become more common. Motor vehicle fuels are going to be consumed less, and so that makes up a significant portion of state revenue. So we're going to be looking at that issue today, and James, thank you for the work that you've put in on this, and please brief us.
Good morning, Chairman Finch and members of the committee. As the chairman said, my name is James Fisher. I'm with the Kansas Legislative Research Department, and I'm their managing IT analyst. If you're curious why someone with IT in their title is up here, it's because I've staffed this committee for about 6 years now, and there's a nexus with telecom, so they decided I should continue staffing this going forward. So as the chair said, the chair and the vice chair had requested that KLRD prepare some background information on what states are considering in order to collect revenue from transportation infrastructure users that drive electric or hybrid vehicles who may pay little to no motor fuels tax. In your packet, there should be two memorandums from my office, one on this topic, one on electric and hybrid vehicle fees that I'll reference a little bit later in my presentation. I'm just going to provide a brief overview of that first memo referenced. Essentially, states are exploring road user charges or vehicle miles travels fees, or some combination of those two items to recover this type of revenue. So right now, 3 states, Oregon, Utah, and Virginia, have enacted programs to do such a thing. And the memo provides a little bit more detail on each, but I'm going to kind of run through some of the key features of those 3 right now. So Oregon's program began in 2015 as a pilot program for 5,000 vehicles. And in 2019, they removed the participation cap and allowed vehicles with a combined MPG of 40 or better to participate in that program. And some of the key features of that program include that participants that opt into that road user charge would no longer have to pay enhanced registration fees for those classes of vehicles. Currently, their fee is set at 1.8 cents per mile, and that fee is also indexed to 5% of their per gallon tax rate, which is unique among the 3 right now. A little bit more of the details of that program. They offer participants 3 options of account management, which is essentially how a user would pay or also have their mileage reviewed or submitted. Those vendors include Azuga, eMovis, and the Oregon Department of Transportation. Azuga and eMovis are pretty common in this, just a heads up on that. Azuga and eMovis offer pay-as-you-go options and also post-usage quarterly payment options. And Azuga also offers a GPS-enabled odometer read and a non-GPS odometer read as well, which is just essentially kind of a reporting using an application. Also, the 2 non-state vendors or third-party vendors offer credits for miles driven out of state if you're using that GPS-enabled option. The Department of Transportation is just essentially a post-usage payment that you would use using odometer readings. And currently it's not compatible with EV vehicles right now. I don't have any information on why that is. I think they just wanted to provide that option for users to have for a non-GPS option. Moving on to Utah, their program began in 2020, and it is a voluntary program offered to electric vehicles and hybrid vehicle drivers within the state. Residents can opt to pay either a flat registration fee or road usage charge or participate in a vehicle miles traveled fee. So features of this program include it's currently set to, the fee is currently set to 1.52 cents per mile. The flat fee is referenced in that second memo. I think it's a sliding scale like to 120 for EVs, and then based on if you have like a hybrid or efficiency vehicle, it would be less because they're factoring in some of the motor fuels tax you would pay for purchasing gasoline. Their account is managed through the vendor, eMovis again. And they provide participants with a GPS-enabled device to record their miles driven, and they have an initial odometer read with a smartphone application. Participants who participate in this program will not pay any more than that flat fee that they could opt in, so they have the opportunity to pay less in this instance. And that's sometimes been a common feature in other states as well that have looked at this. The law established in this program also required the Utah Department of Transportation to provide a report to the legislature outlining a plan to enroll qualified vehicles in the program by December 31st of 2031. And the report provided that the expansion efforts would begin in 2024 and offer 2 scenarios for consideration. The first scenario would require an annual odometer read with a lump sum payment due at the annual vehicle registration. The charge would be assessed on vehicles with a qualified MPG rating of 20 or better. And under this plan, the department anticipates it can enroll 2 million vehicles in 2024. And they also anticipate $7 billion in funding between 2024 and 2031 under that scenario. Scenario 2 Awesome memory for numbers. So that concludes my overview, and I can stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Committee, any questions? Any hands raised online? No? All right. Thank you very much, James. Appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Carmichael.
Yes, Representative Carmichael.
I apologize, I couldn't get to my hands up button, but I just thought for the committee's information, we lost the audio between the time James said he was taking up the second scenario and the time you told him, thank you for your testimony. So those of us online did not have the benefit of the last half of his efforts. I just wanted the committee to be aware of that.
Representative Carmichael, I think the second scenario is the kilowatt per hour charge. Is that about when the audio dropped out?
The last words that we heard from him was said, we'll now turn to the second scenario, and then it went blank. So just want people to know.
I think that was in my discussion on Utah. I can run through it again if the chairperson would like. I would also note that the memo's not entirely lengthy, and a lot of the comments are pretty identical because I am going off of a script up here.
Mr. Chair, Representative Carmichael again. If the audio made it to YouTube, it's real easy to just re-listen to it later, and I have the written material, so I'm not asking that. I just wanted people to be aware that some of us didn't hear what he said.
Great. The audio did not go to YouTube. Can you briefly summarize real quick the second half of your memo, James? Just
Sure can.
bullet points, and then we'll have the written materials posted online as well. But
Absolutely. So beginning where I left off with Utah, again, there were two scenarios. That second scenario was very similar to what was described initially. It would be would utilize a real-time based odometer reading and GPS and allow users to pay as they go. The charge would be assessed on all vehicles with an MPG rating of 30 or better and expand every 2 years to encompass vehicles with a lower efficiency rating. And with that gradual phase-in, they anticipate an expected enrollment in 2024 of 570,000, and they estimate to raise $6.9 billion between 2024 and 2031. And then I would continue on to Virginia, whose program began in 2020 and created a fee for registered electric, alternative fuel, and fuel-efficient vehicles with an MPG rating of 25 or better. This program had a unique way of calculating that fee when compared to the other states. It utilized a hypothetical vehicle with an MPG rating of 23.7 and an average number of miles driven estimation to determine how much a class of vehicle should pay for a fee. And for electric vehicles in particular, that formula would be set to 85% of the estimated fuel tax paid by a vehicle with a combined fuel efficiency rating of 23.7 that drove the average number of miles of a passenger vehicle in the Commonwealth of Virginia. For a fuel efficient vehicle, it would be the difference of their actual motor fuels tax paid using their vehicle specifications for efficiency. That state also established a voluntary mileage-based program, but at this time they didn't have any information on that program. I then provided an overview of road user charge pilot programs. 10 states are in the process of taking a look at that. They're very similar to the 3 that were just described. 12 states are taking a look at or starting to explore and research this option more, including Kansas, and I'm going to let KDOT, that might be a part of their presentation. If they would like me to provide follow-up information for the committee, I can do so at the chair's permission. And then I also noted that there was a hearing on the 25th of January in House Public Safety and Transportation Budget on very similar topics that outlines a lot of what I just went through. If you'd like me to send the testimony out for that, I can as well. And then I provided some options that I found for electric vehicle specific charges, noting a 2021 Oklahoma law that assessed a 3 cent per kilowatt hour for power transfer to electric vehicles at for-profit charging stations, and noted that there was a similar bill that was introduced this session by Representative Riley in the Kansas Legislature that would also assess a 3 cent tax, 3 cent per kilowatt hour tax on certain charging stations in the state.
all right, thank you for that synopsis. Representative Carmichael, your hand is up.
Yes, if I might inquire based on what he just said.
Yep.
Thank you. A friend of mine that I see in the mirror every morning drives a hybrid vehicle. About 2/3 of his mileage is highway mileage to and from Topeka, and the other third is around town. The vast majority of the highway mileage is gasoline. The vast majority of the around town mileage is electric. Um, what types of models have been used in your research to accommodate folks who are paying gasoline taxes on, say, 2/3 of their mileage because we're running on gasoline and are not paying gasoline tax on 1/3? What types of scenarios, if you will, have been developed to deal with those types of users?
So the scenario most commonly I found was that vehicle miles traveled fee, which is essentially would just have an odometer reading or do a GPS enabled device. And because you're not being assessed the motor fuel tax or on all of your travel, you would be paying that road usage fee. You'd theoretically pay your road usage charge. And then if you have any kind of gasoline, you would still pay that motor fuels tax. That's the most common thing. There are some questions in there that I haven't seen addressed, like do they still have a motor fuels tax? They just switch everything to this type of program? I didn't really find anything like that in my research or anything that specifically broke that out. Virginia's kind of has an intermediary step to do that with that 85% of the motor fuels tax, average miles driven component, and then also factoring what you would have paid based on your MPG rating of your vehicle. So since you would have like something in the range of like a 40, probably maybe 50, you would pay you still pay your motor fuels tax, but then when it came to do the fee, you would pay 85% of that minus the difference using this hypothetical vehicle if you were to drive something less fuel efficient.
Don't completely understand, but I appreciate your efforts and thank you.
Any further questions? Thank you, James. Appreciate it. All right, our next conferee this morning will be a presentation from Leighton Yates, the Director of State.
I had my hand up, or I thought I did. It says I do.
Representative Keither.
If I could ask that James would provide the committee with that testimony from the transportation committee hearing, I'd be interested in that.
Yep, sounds good. I'd already asked him to do that beforehand, so he was playing his part and acting like I hadn't yet. So, James,
Okay.
yes, send that testimony. That would be great.
Okay, thank you very much.
Credit to his acting skills and his memory for numbers. Thank you, sir. All right, we're ready to move on to Leighton Yates, Director, State Affairs, Alliance for Automotive Innovation. And Leighton will be with us, I think, via WebEx this morning.
Mr. Chairman, good morning.
Good morning. Do we have, there we go. We have audio and video now.
All right, assuming I can, I'll go ahead and begin. Chairman, Vice Chairman, members of the committee, as you stated earlier, my name is Leighton Yates. I'm the Director of State Affairs for the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. I cover a region that stretches from North Carolina, where I am here, based in Charlotte, all the way out to Colorado. So I've got a mixed bag of states, and I get to see a lot of these issues in a lot of different settings. And I'm looking forward to speaking to you today about the transition to EVs, what we expect, what we're bringing to the table, and what states can do to prepare for the shift in electrification. So I'll go ahead and pull up my slide deck for you. So for those of you that are not familiar with the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, we represent primarily automobile manufacturers. They represent 99% of all cars and light duty trucks sold in the United States each year. We actually have the benefit of having a couple of our members call Kansas home, and Ford and General Motors, as well as Subaru. But we also represent several tier 1 suppliers, as well as technology companies, and being able to have this full stretch and depth of membership allows us to have a real grasp on what's coming from the industry throughout our entire value chain, as we call it, to be able to provide you with the best resources. At Auto Innovators, as we go by for short, we really follow 3 policy pillars, if you want to call them. We advocate for cleaner, safer, and smarter policies. When we get to cleaner, obviously, we are right on topic here in this committee, speaking on environmental issues with clean energy, electric vehicles, fuel efficiency. On the safer side, we're really looking to make sure that you and your precious cargo in your vehicle are safer, as well as those other road users that share the road with you, whether that's pedestrians or other drivers. Usually the issues that come to mind are ones that relate to the advanced driver assist systems, or ADAS. Think of your lane keep, your blind spot detection, those type of technologies. And once we get into smarter, which is a little bit of overlap, are issues like autonomous vehicles that are safer as well as smarter, and even getting down to you as a consumer and all of the technology within the vehicle and how that's being used in your consumer privacy, making sure we're good stewards of all of that information. Before we get into the EV specific info, I really wanted to just take a step back and look at last year. Obviously, the last 2 years for the industry has been quite a challenge, but we're seeing progress and growth, and we're getting back to where we were pre-pandemic. Last year was about 15 million vehicles sold. That was just shy of a quarter of those vehicles were cars, and a little over 3/4 were what we call light trucks. Light trucks, I know that's a broad term, but it actually captures most pickup trucks, crossover utility vehicles, sport utility vehicles, your SUVs, as well as minivans. So it's a very large segment, and it's a segment that's been growing over time, and we expect to see continue grow just based on company offerings and consumer choices based on what they've been purchasing at the dealership lots. If you look at the powertrain breakdown, these are obviously how the vehicles are being powered, their motors. The internal combustion engine vehicles, or ICE vehicles, as I'm going to call them throughout this presentation for short, are really winning the day at 90.5%, and that's gas and diesel. Your hybrid electric vehicles, think of vehicles like your Toyota Prius, those are gaining in popularity. They're at about 5.4%. And the zero emission vehicle segment, which will be the large focus of my presentation today, those include your battery electric vehicles, or EVs for short, your plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, which obviously charge with the plug, but also use traditional motor fuel, as well as fuel cell electric vehicles. And those traditionally right now, the emerging technologies are using hydrogen in those fuel cells. Having said that, while we've seen an uptick in vehicles recovering from the pandemic impacts, zero emission vehicles have actually reached their highest market share nationally that we've seen to date at 4.1%. And that shows a good mark that consumers are starting to adopt them more. But it's still quite a long ways to go before it's really seen on the road as a major impact and something that we expect to grow. But at the moment right now, it's still a fairly low mark in the grand scheme of things. If you look at Kansas' sales, and we have these numbers through September, there's a slow trickle as the end of the year numbers are released. But through September, there were just over 4,200 hybrid electric vehicles. Remember, I mentioned an example as a Toyota Prius. Battery electric vehicles had been sold at just above 1,000 at that point. Fuel cell electric, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles were just over 400 at 421. And there were no fuel cell electric vehicles, and that's not uncommon in most states. The reason being is there is not much infrastructure in the United States currently to support these hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. And if there's no infrastructure, you really can't sell those vehicles in those markets. A lot of the infrastructure as it stands right now is largely centered on the West Coast, which is where most of those vehicles are sold. We do see hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles as a major part of the ZEV discussion going forward, and we expect them to be implemented, through the rest of this decade and definitely beyond that. But to just kind of give you a perspective on the EVs alone, the battery electric vehicles, in Kansas, there's just over 3,000, or at least in June of last year, there were just over 3,000 vehicles registered that were EVs in Kansas. But that's only a third of a percentage point of all the vehicles on the road in Kansas. Between the registrations and the sales, both of those numbers are in the bottom 20 in the US. And that's not to say anything is negative. It just shows where Kansas is situated in the market nationally as to who's adopting these vehicles and how quickly. To get a national picture of where we are today, there's almost 300 million vehicles on the road today, which continues to grow. We've seen consumers holding on to their vehicles a lot more. Naturally, that average has made its way up to about 12 years, 12.1 years. And there's many reasons for that. One of them is the elephant in the room with most new car purchases today are we've reached highs in average vehicle price at about $47,000. And I'm definitely feeling this now. My wife and I just welcomed our son to the world last month, and we're looking to upgrade an older, smaller car to a bigger SUV with the more safety features that are present in most cars today. And the price tag not only is a factor, but we've had supply chain issues, which not only impacts that price, but makes the vehicles more scarce. And we're seeing the lots start to fill in a little more, and we expect them to continue throughout the year and get back to normal. But those are some of the factors and why those vehicles are being held on to for so long. But if you look at the body style, the light truck segment, which I mentioned is everything below the cars in that category, crossovers, SUVs, pickups, vans, they're still winning the day. They're still the majority of vehicles on the road, and we expect to see that trend to continue. But getting to our EV discussion, I would have to start by sharing, the investment from the industry. Between our company announcements, it's a plan that we're investing over $330 billion in vehicle electrification by next year. That's a lot of money in a short amount of time, and it shows you just how serious our members are, our industry is in making this transition and doing it effectively and making sure that consumers have the options to choose from to help ease this transition. And on top of that, all that investment will result in more options and vehicles available in all different segments. We expect upwards of 130 models available in just a few short years in 2026, and even more beyond that. To give you an idea of what's available now, there's about 50 ZEV segment models available right now in the US. So what does all of that investment look like? I think this slide is one of my favorites because it really gives you a good perspective on what's coming, and it stretches all the way up to 2050, which we'll see much change on that end. But to get on the short end, you'll see automakers of all types, foreign, domestic, small volume, large volume. They're not members of ours, but there's also many new entrants to the market, to the auto manufacturing EV market specifically, that make only battery electric vehicles, and they'll be bringing new offerings to the table as well. But to kind of walk you through the timeline, some that stand out to me are Volkswagen in this 2020 to 2024 range. They're planning on no new internal combustion engine vehicle designs from here on out. If you look next to Ford, which, as I mentioned, has operations here in Kansas, they're planning to invest $29 billion by 2025. That's just 3 short years, and a lot of investment that you'll see being put in by them. With Volvo, they're expected to be 100% battery electric, along with brands like Bentley and Ford in Europe in that 2030 to 2024 range. General Motors, who also has a footprint here in Kansas, between 2030 and 2035 and 2039, they'll go all EV. So you'll see that shift, but once you get to 2040 and beyond, what's significant is not only are we cleaning our fleet offerings to consumers, but we're also cleaning our operations and getting to net zero or carbon neutral, from 2040 on. There's many factors in all of this growth and this change, and more environmental focus. Some of that is consumer preference and what they want to buy going forward. Not only are they more environmentally conscious and want to be good stewards, like automakers are, We've also got government goals that have been set, largely for emissions. Last month, the federal government set new emissions rates and goals, and also just, as I mentioned earlier, automakers advocating for cleaner policies, wanting to be good environmental stewards. And this is where some of those plans get put into action. But all signs point towards industry-wide electrification, and we're invested in that and wholeheartedly believe that. Before we look ahead, I want to take a look back. This slide goes back to the summer of 2018, so pre-pandemic all the way to now, and you'll see the different segment sales in the bar graphs. And there's lots of fluctuation. This has been a roller coaster these last couple of years, partly due to vehicle sales numbers going up and down, impacts from the coronavirus. There was supply chain issues. We had factory fires, factory closures due to COVID restrictions, which obviously impacted production and offerings available here and abroad. And while we're climbing out of that, there's still some fluctuation. We expect that stair step to continue to grow. But as I mentioned, we're only at 4.1% of all new cars being sold, and we've got a long way to go. You'll see fuel cell electric vehicles are still pretty small volume at this point, but as infrastructure goes out, we expect that to grow as well, and I'll be able to show you that here shortly. But this is really just to give you a look of where the market's been the last couple of years, and how it's fallen and starting to rebound. A lot of factors will dictate that growth, but third parties expect that by 2027, the ZEV market, including all of those three types of vehicles, will get up to about 15%. These are projections and estimates, and probably generous, because you can look here in 2022, and it's got us upwards of 6%, and we're just at 4.1% now. So we hope that growth will continue, but you'll see the segment breakdown will start to even out a little bit. The blue is the battery electric vehicles, the orange is the plug-in hybrids, but you'll even notice at the top the fuel cell electric vehicles. While there's not many across the U.S. now, they will continue to grow and factor into what we expect to see offered in dealer lots, hopefully in more states as it becomes more common. So while all of that is quite impactful with the projections, all of that is going to need support, and that support is in the form of infrastructure. I mentioned most notably with hydrogen. You can't sell hydrogen vehicles where there's nowhere to refuel a hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle. Some third parties estimate that by the end of the decade, 2030, our country will have needed to invest cumulatively upwards of $39 billion for public charging, and that's to accommodate all of the light duty fleet that'll be on the road. This charging takes a lot of different shapes and forms. You have your at-home charging, which most charging in the United States right now is happening in the low 80 percentile. I want to say 82% is one of the most recent numbers I've seen, and that's your single-family homes as well as your multi-dwelling homes. Think of your apartment buildings, think of your condo buildings, things of that sort. And those will continue to be a factor. Obviously, as people continue to commute, one of the members of your committee recently speaking of the breakdown of their highway versus their local, but when they get to their place of work, do they have a place to charge? That'll be a factor going forward. Obviously, your general public charging stations, but a big factor will be the depots for the fleets. And when I say fleets, I'm thinking of not only your private sector fleets for your delivery companies or your ride sharing companies, but also think of your logistics companies and deliveries, and most notably your state fleets, whether that's for your universities or your different departments and agencies, or even things down to law enforcement type applications. This will stretch and touch all sectors of government and private sector, and the infrastructure needed to support it is laid out here pretty well. But with all of that, estimates show that we're coming up short right now. This slide gives a kind of a cumulative snapshot of what's been dedicated so far for public charging. This is between utilities, some private sector investment, what's been committed, dedicated funding from states, and it all ends up coming up to about 4.5 billion, which is obviously a large amount of money. But in the grand scheme of things, from that last slide, you'll notice I mentioned 39 billion by the end of the decade. So, technically, there's a 35 billion dollar shortfall, and we're working, as an industry and working with government to help make up that shortfall. Most of that investment on the state side, a lot of it has come from California, who's obviously been, the leading state in the EV front, but also New York on the East Coast, who's been a leader on the East Coast in this space. So there is a lot of work to be done, but this, like I said, this will take investment from private sector, the industry itself, as well as government going forward. But in the whole scheme of things, we think there are really four main areas to focus on in this transition to really be successful. And we've touched on the infrastructure from the home to the public to future charging settings such as hydrogen. But we get down to the cost, and that gets back to us as manufacturers, making sure we have not only vehicles that are attainable and affordable, but making sure they're able to be maintained down the road and refueled at a reasonable rate. When you get to production, that's investment from our members. You've heard of the investment from examples like Ford, investing $29 billion in just a few short years. There's many other large investments being made. GM just made a large announcement this week as well. And that is also hopefully going to be spur investment from the government to help, modernize our factories, erect new factories. All of these are obviously job creators across the board, and the industry actually supports over 10 million auto-related jobs already, and that number will likely grow. But we want to invest in our labor, making sure that the people in these factories and designing the vehicles and building the vehicles are trained up on the most modern technology that we have in the factories, and they're able to keep up with the demand that we expect to come. Again, on the supply side, making sure our supply chain is secured here domestically. A lot of the issues with the supply chain were due to reliance on a lot of sources that were not here in the United States. Being able to secure a lot of manufacturing here, whether that's microchip manufacturing, which we've seen recent investment in, all the way down to critical minerals, and making sure that we can at least get them here to get processed and get refined and repurposed into what we may need for these vehicles to be produced. And lastly, the customers are not just individual citizens, but they're also retails and businesses and even state governments. A lot of our members' biggest customers end up being rental car companies, for example. We want to make sure all of those consumers and our constituents are aware of what's available, what the vehicles are able to do. You have choices from your small two-seater coupes now, all the way up to recently announced pickup trucks like GM and Ford have announced, which are exciting, and you even got Jeep Wranglers out there that have plug-in hybrid electric vehicle setup. So we're seeing it diversify into more and more options, and we expect that to continue. So whether you're driving the kids to soccer practice or going off-roading, you've got an option for one of these electrified vehicles. And like I said, just making it convenient, whether that's making sure there's enough dealer lots, making sure you have no anxiety when you're driving from across town or across country, and really making it seamless across the board. From our perspective, we've put together a document. We've basically called it our conditions needed for EV success, and it's really a tool that we hope governments, whether that's federal, state, or local, can use to help prepare for this transition. And it goes in depth on some of the important information that we think. A lot of it is in this presentation, but it gets down to some of the other areas to think of as you prepare for this EV transition. And I'm happy to share this with the committee afterwards if anyone has interest. But our large advocacy platform on this issue is really called for a bold and comprehensive strategy. It's across the board, all levels of government, the entire country, and it's focused on the consumers, it's focused on the infrastructure, and the manufacturing side, as we touched on a little bit. With the consumer side, it's reducing the upfront cost for them. Right now, it's no secret that there is not price parity, meaning the ICE vehicle costs as much as the ZEV equivalent of it. So if I have a ICE gas using pickup truck versus a ZEV EV pickup truck, they're not comparable yet, but we expect that to come in the coming years. Some have said as early as next year. Many have said from 2025 and beyond, we expect that to come into play. But regardless, that's our goal, is to make sure that there is no compromise. When you go to the dealer, if you want what you want, you're able to get it. When we get back to the ZEV adoption requirements, the fleet adoptions, that is, one of the biggest focus areas a state can make is in the fleet. These vehicles will not only emit less, cleaning air fleets, they'll save money long term. Their EVs have been known to have less maintenance costs, less moving parts. So obviously, over the long term, there's less maintenance there, and hopefully that'll save the state government, federal government, local government significant money. And more than anything, we think it sets an example and sets the tone for a state. If your constituents, the people who live in your jurisdiction see these vehicles on the road, whether it's in public transit or your employees using these vehicles that work for the department or different agencies, it sets a tone for them and gets them into those vehicles, and really will hopefully spur some of that engagement on the consumer side to get them considering EVs more. On the infrastructure side, right now there's incentives at a lot of different levels of government to build out charging at home. If you bought an EV and you don't have the wiring, or the outlets to plug in your vehicle, there's tax credits for that type of installation, as well as for businesses, and we encourage those to continue. One of the one issue I've seen that surprised a lot of people is building codes. Obviously, most buildings to date that have been built are not EV ready, as we call them. EV ready is either wired to eventually be used for EVs, built with plugs for EVs, or ideally built with charging stations already erected at the end of the construction. We think this is somewhere that can really save all levels of government some money. If you think of retrofitting a building, so a building that doesn't have any of this technology, and installing it, it can end up costing 5 to 7 times what it would cost if you just built the building, new construction going forward, to be EV ready and EV capable. That goes for not only your private buildings, your businesses, your state buildings, but also new homes, because as we mentioned, 80% of charging happens at home, and as these new houses and dwellings are being occupied and purchased, many of those owners or dwellers will have an EV or a plug-in hybrid of some sort, eventually fuel cell electric vehicle. So making sure the building codes are updated to make sure that they're EV ready going forward. Obviously, very relevant to this committee is the electric grid, making sure it's improved, it's resilient, able to take on that additional charge and additional pull from the EVs, whether that's incentivizing times to charge and when not to charge, and going forward. And I mentioned the retrofits, but there's also some grant funding opportunities to fund retrofits currently. I mentioned, new construction should be EV ready, but obviously what we have now mostly isn't, and there is grant funding out there to make those changes and make that transition for that construction. And lastly, the innovation, manufacturing, and supply chain. This lands on the industry, which I mentioned. We've got $330 billion dedicated, and that's just up to 2023. There'll be much more beyond that. But a lot of this innovation can continue to be spurred with government investment, making sure we can secure our manufacturing and supply chain and continue to innovate, be a leader in this space around the globe, and be an example instead of following. That gets back to investing in our workforce, making sure we can secure new factories, modernize factories here, and incentivize all of that going forward. So I know some of you are thinking all of that sounds nice, but how do we fund that? And the answer is there's no answer. There's no de facto solution. The gentleman speaking before, I know he spoke on one method of these, but we've really seen a few attempts. They've got different names, different options. First, they're usually based on vehicle type, and the most common form of these are electric vehicle registration fees, or registration fees for plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. Some states even pull in hybrids, but those vehicles use a significant amount of motor fuel. We've seen mileage-based user fees, sometimes VMT is what it's called, or road user charges. And while we have some privacy concerns with those, there's pilots across the country happening, and we're generally not opposed to those pilots going on and states exploring these options, because it is a real problem. We've also seen fees based on weight, but those have not seemed to have much merit thus far. And there's also, as I'll speak to in a little bit, some federal investment, federal funds coming to the states, as well as additional grants that can be taken advantage of. We look at markets right now, and as I mentioned, less than 1% of all the cars on the road in Kansas are EVs, about less than 0.5%, honestly. So making sure that we want to make sure that whatever fees or taxes are levied in a state, that they're equitable and fair and comparable to what someone with an ICE vehicle pays a motor fuel tax in a year. And in Kansas, that is roughly around $100, which is pretty equitable compared to what your fee is for registration fees. And speaking of registration fees, this kind of gives you a snapshot of where we are in the country, who's passed these, and where. You can tell it's not just red states or blue states; it's across the board, and the fees are pretty wide ranging. Some are as low as $50, and some go up to $225. I will note that most of the fees are on EVs, but there are also some that charge the registration fee for plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, Kansas being one of those states. But I'll also note, as I mentioned, that median fee is around $100, and that's where Kansas is right now, and it's reflective of where the market is currently. Many of these fees that are in the high hundreds and 200s are typically seen as punitive. Most of them are in states where the EV market is fairly low. I mentioned Kansas is about 20th. There's many states that are well below Kansas that are charging exorbitant registration fees, and a lot of those are, aimed at slowing the growth of EVs and this type of transition. And it's something we hope is not a common thread among states, and we hope that a state like Kansas, states take note of what Kansas is doing and charging something that is equitable and comparable for where we are right now. But we've also seen, outside of registration fees, as the gentleman mentioned earlier, the road user charges. There's several clusters of cooperative states in the country. The yellow is the Eastern Transportation Coalition, and the green is what we call RUC West. But even within RUC West, there are smaller collaborative agreements. Oregon and Utah, they have existing programs for their road user charge, but there's also 13 states that have gotten federal money to stand up their own pilot programs and explore this. And that's California, Delaware, Hawaii, Texas, Wyoming, Kansas, and Minnesota. I just learned recently that Kansas and Minnesota are collaborating for their RUC Midwest pilot program, which I think is about to kick off pretty soon here. They've been doing a lot of public outreach before launching their program. There's also Missouri, Utah, New Hampshire, Ohio, Oregon, and Washington. So there's a lot of interest, a lot of interested states to see if this can work in the near term for them, or if it's something they want to consider. And we're largely, unopposed to those projects going on. We do have some general concerns, whether they're discriminatory to EVs, privacy concerns, how are they implemented? A lot of them are using methods like odometer readings, GPS, inserting a dongle, which is basically a plug you would plug into your onboard diagnostic port, your OBD port in your car, cellular units, as well as smartphone tracking. And there's a lot of, security protocols that we would hope will be implemented. And, a lot of this information is being used by third parties and collected by third parties. And we just want to make sure, for your sake and our sake, that there are, safeguards put up. And some of these are voluntary and some of them are not. And we want to make sure that choice is out there. But having said that, I want to finish by at least mentioning the federal relief that is coming this way. Congress has luckily been able to pass a bill recently that's been significant. In this last December, they passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. It provides $7.5 billion dedicated for EV infrastructure to the states, which is the biggest investment we've seen from the federal government thus far in this space. Of that $7.5 billion, $5 billion will go to states solely, based on a formula. Kansas ended up coming out with $400 million, which is a significant chunk of money, and it's all based on population and size of state and whatnot. But that other $2.5 billion is all grant funding. Some of it will be for use along federal highways, and there's also a grant program, the community grant program, that can be used for more isolated projects that are not along highways throughout your states, local communities. And we hope that those will help fill in the gaps in the EV charging network nationally, which is what this money is meant to do, to help connect us from coast to coast and from state to state. But to give you just a snapshot of what everyone's allotment looks like, Kansas with their 40 million is right about median, which is about where you should be compared to size of state population. But we think this is a great down payment for any state, and a great start to building out infrastructure. And we hope that the benefits are seen in your local communities and throughout your state. And happy to provide any extra information for you. But that is all I have for you today. And again, I appreciate the time, and happy to follow up with anybody and answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Yates. We do have a couple committee questions for you. Start with Representative Mason.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just, if I may, just 2 or 3 quick questions. Mr. Yates, thank you for being here virtually. You talked about the retrofitting for residential, like older homes. Can you tell me what is going to be required for someone to have like a fully electric vehicle, and what they would need to have installed in their home, in their garage?
You mean to retrofit an existing home that wasn't built EV ready?
Right. Yeah. Like my home was built in '63, and they did not anticipate this in 1963. So what I'm saying is, if one who had a home that old wanted to retrofit it, put in the charging stations for a vehicle or two, what would they need to do? Can you walk me through that in terms of amperage? Is that per vehicle? Is that just the whole thing?
Right. I think where it would start is, my home. I'm a new homeowner. We purchased our house last summer, and we at this point had to upgrade our voltage panel for our house, just because it wasn't allowing any additional investment. We wanted lights outside or wanted to get a charger added. So that would probably be a place to start, is to see how much voltage you would need, how much your voltage at your house can handle, and upgrading that panel. Also getting down to installing the plug for your charger. Some plugs you can just plug into the wall, and some can be built onto the house. Those are all of varying degrees of cost. But as I mentioned, the federal government, they provide a tax credit for that. And I'm pretty sure, I don't think Kansas does at the moment, but many states and local governments do provide incentives to help, recoup some of that cost for the installation of the charging station. So it'd be your house voltage panel itself, as well as the installation of the charging plug to plug in your vehicle.
Okay, so per vehicle, what are we talking about? 50 amps, 75 amps, 100 amps?
They vary. Some of the older vehicles, they charge much slower, which is fine because most of it is overnight. I couldn't really give you a precise amperage just because some of them charge at different speeds than others, and pull from the grid, pull from your house's voltage differently. But I can get you something specific afterwards.
All right, we'll call it good there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Keither.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You guys live in baby houses. Mine's over 100 years old, so come on. We do hear things about following up really with Representative Mason in terms of the home charging. Understanding the rates are different, but we hear all sorts of things out there about neighborhoods going black if everybody charges their cars overnight, and that sort of thing, which I think is not realistic because everybody's charging a multitude of things already in their houses at home. So could you kind of walk me through that scenario that's not likely to happen?
Yeah, well, we haven't seen that happen anywhere as a result from charging EVs right now, especially in communities where they're more dense. Think of mostly your West Coast states, but even states like Texas have tons of EVs, as well as Florida. Their top three is in New York as well. A lot of that comes down to, how resilient is your grid, how modern is your grid, if they've made upgrades recently or not. But a lot of places have actually incentivized timing to help, break up the drain on the grid. They have incentivized pricing for charging at off-peak hours. Obviously, peak hours would be, we're at home at dinner and our car's plugged in and we wake up and unplug it. But there's also incentives to charge it off of those peak hours to help break up some of the drain on the grid all at one time. So there's different mechanisms that can be used, but it's not something we've seen at the moment. EVs right now, the ones that charge at home charge much slower at a slower draw, and it's not as dramatic as one as you would see at a traditional modern EV charging station out on the road.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think this leads into the fact that we're going to have the SPP presentation in the 1st of February. And this is one of the reasons I wanted all this to come together, because the electric grid is going to play a part in going forward with EVs. And I just think this is fascinating, and the future is coming at us quickly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know our time is short, but just in real quick response to Representative Mason, I've had a first generation machine now for 7 years. The charger that came with it, 110 volt charger, it draws between about 7 and 12 amps. And you can I plugged it into the normal circuit in the garage, just like anything else that could take that type of capacity. And it takes roughly 6 to 10 hours to go to a full charge. $600 more, get a 240 volt charger. It charges much quicker, maybe 4 hours or so for a full charge. It runs on a 30 amp dual pole breaker, but its actual amperage draw is usually somewhere around 7 or 8 amps when it's actually charging. The newer systems, they charge faster, they have faster draws. And the only final other expense was, it was a good excuse to bring 240 service out to my garage. And so, that meant digging a trench and paying the electrician about $400. So that was just what it cost me. Thanks.
Any further questions? Last question from Representative Delperdang.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On your favorite page, as you referred to, it was page 7. You'd talked about getting into 2040 timeframe. A lot of the companies were going carbon neutral. And I'm just trying to, can I have your definition of carbon neutral, please?
How I take that is them just offsetting the carbon that they're emitting into the environment in their production of their vehicles, cleaning up their manufacturing processes on the back end, whether that's carbon capture or whatnot. I think all of them will have different methods of it. Obviously some of those are here domestically, but many of our members are foreign and abroad, and we'll tackle that differently.
Okay, because I was curious if you were looking at manufacturing, are you looking at the lithium mining, what it does environmentally? What about the factories themselves, recycling of batteries? I was just curious if you were including all that, or if we're not sure at this time.
I think all of those are a factor. I don't have a cumulative, if you want to call it, formula for it, but we expect as manufacturers at the end of the battery life cycles to collect them. As I mentioned, being good stewards of the environment, cleaning up our factories and making them more modern and more efficient. So I think all of those will factor in, and to varying degrees from company to company.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yates, for your time and your presentation this morning. If you would send any additional information you have to Susan, our committee assistant, we will get that distributed to the committee. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Have a great one.
All right. Our last presenter today, we are honored to have the Secretary of the Kansas Department of Transportation, Secretary Lorenz, has made time in her schedule. We appreciate that very much, that you could be here today to talk to us about what's going on in Kansas. So
Sure,
welcome to the committee.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here today, and I will try to keep while I have quite a bit of material, I'll try to keep it really narrowed down in on specific to Kansas transportation. Let's go on to, we'll get ourselves organized and then we'll go to the second slide. But so I'll do a little soft shoe while we're getting it up. While I'm not an economist, as I go through this presentation, I'll have at least as many hands as an economist. I'll have it on this hand, and this hand. So just be ready. It's a real mixed bag, and those that I see in transportation or in the subcommittee know, there are a lot of things to consider. Okay, good deal. All right, so I ate up the time that I needed. Well, I thought. But there are a lot of things to consider as we look to the future. Okay, let's see if we can go. There we go. Okay, Brendan, I use the clicker, so I think we're ready to roll. Okay, so exactly right. I appreciated Leighton's presentation as well as KLRD. As new vehicles emerge, there's no doubt, because we rely, about a third of our revenue is based on motor fuels tax, we know that revenue over time will decline. That's absolutely true. Both because we're seeing incentives for EVs under the Biden administration, and because we've seen for a long time increasing incentives to increase mileage, right? So that we know. Perhaps, and I mean, I think it just sort of depends also on where you are in terms of adoption rates in the country. 40% of vehicles may be electric by 2050. Sometimes you want to look for a watershed moment. This is probably the one that I think hit a lot of us during the Super Bowl when we saw the F-150 is going to be electric. Production has been advanced just a little bit, and as I understand it, it's this quarter, Q1 of 2022, that those will start rolling off the line. They're going to go faster, have more torque, and more horsepower than that model has had previously. So it's the real deal. It's going to be a good vehicle that people are going to want to buy. Now, as it relates to Kansas specifically, and I think our numbers were pretty similar, they may not be exact, but very close, about 6,700 vehicles, electric and hybrid. We charge a registration fee of $50 on electric, and I don't think that, and $100 on hybrid. That probably should be switched. I don't think that sounds quite right. We passed that in 2019, and what I want to point back to is because nothing in Kansas transportation, or it's rare, that we just jump headlong into something, okay? We had taken time through the legislative task force that was convened in 2018, had meetings all across the state, heard from citizens everywhere, and one of the charges of the task force was to take a look at how might the department, Kansas, start looking at generating new sources of revenue, recognizing even back then that this was going to be an issue. Certainly registration fees are one of those things. That was also the year in which expanded tolling legislation was passed, And we have a managed lane project that's already been initiated in Johnson County, where additional capacity in new lane can be tolled. That's not going to work everywhere in our state, but in really populated areas, it can. So again, we have a history of good engagement with citizens so that we can make good decisions that everybody understands and we bring people along. Here's the map of where we currently see electric vehicles and plug-in registered by county. The darker the color, the more registrations we have. Not surprisingly, we see, just as a function, I think it's just more a numbers game than anything else, you see more electric and hybrids in the more populated areas, but also that's where more chargers are located. So there's certainly a bit of a dependency or a dependent relationship there. Now, as it relates to hydrogen vehicles, and I would be the first to say I'm not a vehicle engineer, I'm not a mechanical engineer, I'm no engineer of anything. But what I understand from reading is that that hydrogen vehicles are not as efficient as electric vehicles. Currently, we don't believe that there are any registered in Kansas. I mean, I can't swear to that, but we couldn't find record of it. And in terms of refueling for hydrogen, currently only in California and Hawaii. I'd like to take a quick little side note here. Something that I am very interested in is induction charging. So while that hasn't been raised within the bill, it's important to know. So the idea is as you're driving and you've got coils in the pavement, you got like a little pad on your car and a pad on top of the pavement. As you're rolling along, you can charge as you roll. In fact, there's a pilot going on at the new airport in Kansas City to take a look at charging an electric vehicle while you do that. I think what's important to understand is that there are many ways to look at charging or refueling. So I am curious/concerned to think about charging the fuel source when in fact what we at the department actually sell is road. If you think about from an economic standpoint, you want to charge for the amount of road you're consuming, not based on the kind of fuel you use. So that's just something to tuck in the back of your mind as we continue to talk. All right, most of you would be familiar with how we fund transportation. We have federal funds, we have motor fuel, we do some bonding, we're paying that down, and sales tax. We share some of that money with through a special city county highway fund, as we should. We are a system of systems. City and county systems have to be able to access the state system. We have a state highway fund. Some dollars are transferred over, like to the highway patrol and to revenue for gas tax collection. These are all funds, and as you can see here, sales tax accounts for about 33% of our revenue, motor fuels tax about 25%, and federal funds about 27%. Okay, important to note, a lot of those federal funds are underwritten by federal gas tax. So we are dependent, not entirely, but gas tax is important to funding both the Eisenhower Legacy Transportation Program that we have today and for the next 8 years, and for whatever the next transportation program is after Ike. So here are our projections for motor fuels tax. And as you can see, we project currently a slight increase in motor fuels tax collection, less than 1% growth, because we're seeing people continue to drive more, they continue to use gas. Okay, that's the first hand. The second hand is that we don't really know how quickly new vehicles might entice buyers to buy EV vehicles. And we heard Leighton say, you know, now he's got a baby, he's looking at buying a new vehicle, but they're expensive, so that's sort of the third hand. So many factors come into play. This is exactly the conversation we should be having right now, which is to prepare for the future, no doubt. I also don't want you to worry extremely about the next year or two, because we think that motor fuels tax receipts will grow, but not much, and certainly they're not keeping up with inflation. So, you know, lots of things to consider there. Here's the thing that concerns me, and I think probably encapsulates why it's time to start the conversation. So you can see transportation funding in the long run does change. Look out at the 2045 number. Because we project over time we'll have less in gas tax, we've come in at 60% for sales tax by 2045. And I don't think anybody thinks that's necessarily a great or sustainable idea. So that's not tomorrow. This isn't a light switch. We're not in light switch situation, but we're smart to be thinking about what that looks in the long term. And I'll tell you, every single state is having a similar kind of conversation. Some states are ahead of us, but we're all DOTs are worried about what it's going to look like in the long run. Here are some things that other states are doing. We talked about registration fees, a road usage charge, which we'll talk about in just a minute, a tax on electricity. Colorado and Pennsylvania have said, hey, let's put a little on e-commerce delivery. So they put a small surcharge on that, recognizing all the FedEx trucks, and not just FedEx, UPS, everybody, a lot of traffic on the road. So they put a little fee on that. And then I think KLRD covered the Utah situation and how their pilot program is working. So I'll just scoot on. So what are we doing in Kansas? We knew, even in 2018, 2019, that we needed to do a study. And prior to coming back to KDOT, in my previous job, I actually worked on the I-95 corridor as we did a road usage charge study over there. There is no doubt that in the Midwest, we shouldn't be having this conversation. We absolutely should. If we don't do the study so that we have data to represent ourselves, the coasts are going to tell us how a road usage charge study or how a road usage charge program would work. So we have initiated a study in Kansas. We are particularly reaching out to rural communities, the ag industry, and commercial trucking so that we can take some of our unique characteristics, big geography, not a lot of people, rural, ag, those things into account. So we've started our study. Man, I can't say it enough. I can't underscore it enough. Entirely voluntary. Nobody has to do it. Chambers of Commerce, quite frankly, have been very interested in participating so their members can get a handle on it, but it's entirely voluntary. Nobody has to do it. Here are the 3 steps. And we are unique in the country because the good news, when you aren't at the front of the pack, you can take lessons from other states. So we're starting first with lots of conversations, pilot focus groups, that sort of thing, to say what Representative Gartner might worry you about this approach, and then we shape the study based on what we hear from various constituencies. When we design the study, you choose. Do you want to use old-fashioned pen and paper to record where you're traveling? Do you want to have an app on your phone? We'll offer a variety of technologies because the concept here is to charge you for the number of miles you drove, not for the fuel you used. It may be based on, I mean, like in my dream world, we would charge you not only for how many miles you drive, but it's on what road at what time. So if you choose to drive on I-35 at 8 in the morning, you would be charged more than on, K99 in Chautauqua County, because the I-35 is a better quality road than K99. Now, how we get there from here, I don't know, but that would be in an ideal world where you charge based on the service and the quality you're providing. All right, we talked a little bit about BILL, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. These are the numbers that are coming to Kansas. These are additional funds, okay? It is very helpful, but it is not truckloads of money, but it's helpful, okay? We have certainty for 5 years. We have $89 million additional each year for highways, the $45 million for bridges. I'm happy to talk to anybody anytime about bridges because that's where our biggest problem is. On the local side, county bridges need all the help they can get. We get $8 million per year for electric vehicle charging and for electrification of the fleet. I'll come back and talk about that in just a minute. Rural transit, $3.7 million. I'm concerned about that. We have a hard time finding a bus driver. It's not that there aren't needs for rural transit. The delivery is tough. We also know that we have discretionary grants available. We'll be going out to try to get more federal dollars. Those dollars are going to be spent one way or another. We ought to try to get some of those in Kansas, and we've already hired a grant writer. Okay, EV settlement money, $2.3 million came to the department like last summer for administration. We got the award letters out last Friday. We've identified, we hope to do 12 stations. We were only able to do 7. We are using, and I want to be really clear here, the rural electrification model. Think back to how electricity got spread all across the United States in a rural sort of way. We're not owning that infrastructure. KDOT, the state's not going to own the infrastructure. We don't need to own more stuff. It's privately owned. What we're here to do is to help facilitate with some seed money and to kind of make sure we're getting to the routes that have the highest need. I was really glad to talk to the rural electric co-ops on Monday. I talked to Farm Bureau yesterday, And they're very interested in understanding how's this going to work and how can we tap into these dollars. We will, like we do on all of our dollars, put a work group together. It's not just where is all the traffic, it's also where are our freight corridors, because we need to make sure as big trucks start to become electric that they have the opportunity to charge. I think we heard some good questions about grid modernization, which I can't answer, but I think there are a lot of pieces to the pie that do need to be considered, no doubt about that. So I think I talked about what we'll be doing in terms of working with groups of people, hearing input as we figure out the best way to leverage those dollars. So this is my next to the last slide. There are way more questions, I'd say, than answers as we think about transitioning away from the gas tax. Privacy, absolutely a concern. My bigger concern is the cost to collect. It's relatively cheap, simple, straightforward to collect gas tax. All the things we're talking about here are, because they're new, they're more expensive to collect. So we got to kind of crack the code on that. When I talk about interoperability, we share the gas tax with our cities and counties. If we're not collecting gas tax, we got to figure out how we proportionally share with cities and counties. We see states that offer incentives for EV and hybrids. We're one of 5 states that don't incentivize that use. We are concerned about rural and urban equity. We know we need a method that's easy to use. We know change is hard. I've talked a little bit about induction charging. I think that's fascinating. We know new technologies are coming on board. So with this, I want to say thank you. Thank you for thinking about the future. And it's messy. So I applaud you. I think it's healthy to have these discussions. Would love to keep you involved as we go through the road usage charge study, because I think that's going to give us a roadmap for understanding how Kansans feel about a road usage charge, so we can and by the way, we don't intend to implement one. We're studying it now to know what that might look like in the future. Happy to stand for questions.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. When is your road usage study, you think, estimated completion?
So around 24. So it's a deliberative conversation, and then we want citizens to be able to try different technologies, get their thoughts about it. Quite frankly, we would never implement a road usage charge study in Kansas if there wasn't one at the national level, because it just doesn't work that way. So we've got a little time, but we need to do it.
Questions for the Secretary? Any hands up on WebEx?
It's a pretty fascinating topic.
We think so.
But it's also 2 minutes till you close, so.
Representative Esau?
I can't let the Secretary have no questions.
Thank you.
It's good to see you again. You may have covered this and I may have blinked, but is there a difference in how much we would charge based on the weight of the vehicles, since obviously the weight is a lot of the wear and
We haven't
tear
gotten
on the
that far
roads?
yet. That is a very good question. Haven't gotten that far yet. Haven't gotten that far. Thank you.
Any other questions? Madam Secretary, I really do want to thank you. I know that you had to sacrifice and make some accommodations to be here today, and we do appreciate that very much on behalf of the committee. We'd love to be kept abreast of developments as they occur at KDOT concerning this issue. It touches on tax, touches on transportation, touches on utilities. If there's ever any information that we can help provide back to the agency, let us know.
Thank you, and thanks for making time today.
Anything else for the good of the order, members of the committee? Next week, we have small-scale nukes, and we have Southwest Power Pool. So we will continue our to trip the light fantastic through the world of utilities. So if there's nothing else, we will be adjourned. Have a good weekend. Go Chiefs.